Imagine a world where Apple, the company known for its tightly controlled ecosystem and premium hardware, suddenly announces something unexpected. Its own Linux distribution. Not a hidden subsystem, not a developer tool, but a full-fledged Apple-designed Linux OS built for everyday users. The announcement drops quietly at first, maybe at a developer conference, but within hours it explodes across the tech world. People are confused, excited, skeptical. Why would Apple, a company that built its empire on macOS and iOS, step into the open source universe in such a direct way? To understand how big this would be, you have to think about what Apple represents. Apple is about control, polish, and seamless integration. Linux, on the other hand, represents freedom, flexibility, and community-driven innovation. These two worlds have always existed side by side, but rarely overlap in a meaningful way for mainstream users. If Apple were to build its own Linux distro, it wouldn't just be another operating system. It would be a collision of philosophies. Picture the reveal. Apple introduces a new OS, maybe called something like Apple Open or macOS Core Linux Edition. They explain that it's built on the Linux kernel, but redesigned from the ground up with Apple's design language, security standards, and ecosystem integration. They say it's faster, more secure, and more adaptable than ever before. And then they drop the key point. It's open source, at least partially. Immediately, developers start asking questions. How open is it really? Is Apple just using Linux as a base while keeping everything else locked down? Or are they genuinely contributing back to the community? Because if Apple commits to true open source collaboration, this could reshape the entire tech industry. Now imagine what this OS looks like. The first thing you notice is the interface. It has that unmistakable Apple feel, clean, minimal fluid animations, but underneath, it's powered by Linux. The terminal isn't just there as an afterthought. It's deeply integrated, powerful, and fast. Developers can access native Linux tools without any hacks or virtual machines. No more workarounds, no more compatibility layers. Everything just works. But Apple wouldn't stop at design. They would optimize the system heavily for their hardware. Think about MacBooks running a Linux-based OS that is perfectly tuned for Apple Silicon. Battery life could improve even further. Performance could become even more efficient. Thermal management, already impressive. Might reach new levels because Apple controls both the hardware and the kernel At the same time, Apple would likely introduce something completely new, a curated open source app store. Imagine an app store where developers can publish both open source and proprietary apps, but with Apple's strict quality control. You could browse powerful Linux tools, creative software, development environments, and even games all optimized for this new OS. It would bring the chaotic beauty of Linux software into a structured, user-friendly environment. Now, think about developers. For years, many developers have used Linux because of its flexibility and control. Others have used macOS because of its polish and ecosystem. If Apple creates a Linux distro, those two groups suddenly overlap. Developers who prefer Linux might finally get Apple's hardware and design without compromise. Meanwhile, macOS users who've never touched Linux might slowly discover its power through Apple's simplified interface. This could lead to a massive shift in developer culture. Tools like Docker, Kubernetes, and native Linux servers would feel completely at home. Web developers, AI engineers, and system programmers would find themselves working in an environment that feels both familiar and revolutionary. It could become the ultimate development machine. But there's another side to this story. The Linux community might not fully trust Apple at first. Apple has a history of building closed ecosystems. Even if they release a Linux-based OS, people will wonder whether Apple is truly embracing open source or just leveraging it for their own gain. Questions about licensing, contributions, and transparency would dominate discussions on forums and social media. And honestly, that skepticism would be justified. Apple would have to prove itself. They would need to actively contribute to the Linux kernel, support upstream projects, and engage with the community in a meaningful way. If they don't, this distro could be seen as just another corporate fork rather than a true open source effort. Now, imagine the impact on existing Linux distributions. Distros like Ubuntu, Fedora, and Arch Linux have built strong communities over the years. If Apple enters the space, it could disrupt everything. On one hand, it might bring millions of new users to Linux. On the other hand, it could overshadow smaller distros and shift attention toward Apple's version. However, it could also push innovation forward. Competition often leads to better products. If Apple introduces new design standards, performance optimizations, or user-friendly features, other distros might adopt similar ideas. The entire Linux ecosystem could evolve faster as a result. Let's talk about security. Apple is known for its focus on privacy and security. If they build a Linux distro, they would likely implement advanced security features on top of the Linux kernel. This could include stricter sandboxing, enhanced encryption, and more transparent privacy controls. Users might get the best of both worlds: Linux's inherent security and Apple's additional protections. Now, consider the enterprise world. Companies rely heavily on Linux for servers and infrastructure. If Apple creates a Linux distro that integrates seamlessly with their hardware and services, it could become a serious player in enterprise environments. Businesses might start adopting Apple hardware, not just for design or development, but for back-end systems as well. And then there's the integration with Apple's ecosystem. This is where things get really interesting. Imagine a Linux-based Apple OS that syncs perfectly with iPhones, iPads, and other Apple devices. You could start a task on your phone and continue it on your Linux-powered Mac without any friction. Messages, files, notifications, all seamlessly connected. Apple could also bring features like AirDrop, iCloud, and continuity into this Linux environment. Suddenly, Linux isn't just powerful, it's also incredibly convenient. This could attract a whole new audience of users who previously avoided Linux because it felt too complex or disconnected. But what about compatibility with existing macOS apps? Apple would need to address this carefully. They might introduce a compatibility layer or encourage developers to rebuild their apps for the new platform. Over time, we could see a transition where major applications are optimized specifically for Apple's Linux. Gaming could also see a boost. Linux gaming has improved significantly in recent years, but it's still not perfect. With Apple's resources and influence, they could push for better game support, optimized graphics, drivers, and partnerships with game developers. This could make Linux gaming more mainstream than ever before. Now, let's think about education. Schools and universities often use Linux because it's free and customizable. If Apple offers a polished Linux distro, educational institutions might adopt it as a standard platform. Students would get a powerful, user-friendly system that prepares them for both development and real-world applications. There's also the possibility of customization. Traditional Linux users love the ability to tweak and modify their systems. Apple, however, tends to limit customization to maintain consistency. If they create a Linux distro, they would need to find a balance between these two approaches. Maybe they allow deeper customization for advanced users while keeping a simple interface for beginners. And what about updates? Apple is known for its smooth and reliable updates. If they bring this approach to Linux, it could solve one of the biggest pain points in the Linux world. Users could get regular, stable updates without worrying about breaking their system. Now imagine the long-term impact. If Apple successfully creates a Linux distro and gains widespread adoption, it could change how people perceive open source. Linux might no longer be seen as just a tool for developers and enthusiasts. It could become a mainstream operating system used by millions of everyday users. At the same time, it could influence other companies. If Apple embraces Linux, other tech giants might follow. We could see a shift toward more open source collaboration across the industry. This could lead to faster innovation, better software, and more choices for users. But there's always a risk. If Apple controls too much of this ecosystem, it could limit the freedom that makes Linux special. The challenge would be maintaining the balance between control and openness. If they get it right, it could be revolutionary. If they get it wrong, it could create tension within the community. So what would this mean for the future? It's hard to predict exactly, but one thing is clear. It would blur the lines between closed and open systems. It would bring together two very different philosophies and force them to coexist. In the end, the idea of Apple creating its own Linux distro isn't just about technology, it's about the future of computing. It's about whether companies and communities can work together to create something better than what either could achieve alone. And maybe, just maybe, it's about a future where users don't have to choose between power and simplicity, between freedom and convenience. A future where everything just works. But you still have the freedom to make it your own. That's the kind of future that could redefine everything we know about operating systems. And if it ever happens, it won't just be another product launch. It will be a turning point in the history of technology.